Buongiorno a tutti voi. Non farò adesso commenti a proposito della conversione di San Paolo, ma lo facciamo più tardi. Questo dialogo tra gli atti degli apostoli e le lettere paoline sembra sempre un po' difficile, certo, Don Antonio. Allora, voglio presentarvi e sono lieto di avere qua con noi la professoressa Kathy Ehrensperger. Allora, ieri l'abbiamo sentita, oggi voglio semplicemente ricordare per coloro che non lo hanno sentito e per coloro che ci seguono nel canale YouTube che la professoressa ora lavora a Potsdam, Berlino. È conosciuta per molte delle sue pubblicazioni. Prima di menzionare qualcuna, vi racconto che ha fatto la sua tesi nell'Università di Wales. E la tesi era Feminist Interpretation of Paul and Changing Perspective in Pauline Studies. E mi pare che su quella base è stata pubblicata più tardi un libro suo, That We May Be Mutually Encourage, Feminism and the New Perspective. Più recentemente ha pubblicato Searching Paul, Conversation with the Jewish Apostle to the Nations. Prima aveva pubblicato il libro che ieri ha menzionato il padre Don Antonio Pitta, Paul at the Crossroads of Cultures. E prima, nel 2007, aveva pubblicato Paul and the Dynamics of Power. Quindi vedete come si è mossa un po' la professoressa da un interesse inizialmente femminista più a altri interessi correlati con il potere, con il background giudeo e anche ellenistico dell'Apostolo. Voglio menzionare due cose che almeno io ritengo importanti. La professoressa appartiene alla Societas Novi Testamenti Studiorum, lì ci siamo incontrati qualche anno fa. È una cosa che è un po' personale però che io ritengo importante per l'assemblea che c'è qua vicina. Ha avuto diverse esperienze internazionali, insegnando nel Sudafrica e anche a Kuala Lumpur, oltre l'insegnamento nell'Inghilterra, e adesso lavora, come vi ho detto, a Potsdam, Berlino. Quindi ecco, ha un bel raggio internazionale di presenza nella ricerca, anche nella diffusione della ricerca. Allora con voi la professoressa Ehrensperger. Thank you, Kathy, for being with us.
It is a great pleasure and honor to be with you. Thank you for this very kind introduction. To add to my international flavor, I was born and brought up in the city of Basel in Switzerland. So from Switzerland around the world. I'm very grateful to be here with you. And the topic this morning is women in 1 Corinthians, so to say. So let's see what we can do here. To say at first, Paul and gender, that's an uneasy pair. And when we add Paul's Jewishness to the mix, the combination is often considered even more complex. No doubt, Paul lived in a context of elite male domination. The views about women he explicitly formulates reflect in most stances this general perception. Interestingly, however, is that his actual practice seems to indicate a slightly different stance, in that women are among those whom Paul explicitly considered to play a decisive and leading role in the work of the gospel. Concerning his role, Paul's role as a leading man in the movement, Paul clearly establishes or tries to establish his authority. He claims authority over others. That constitutes an asymmetrical relationship. So we need to check how these different perceptions, these different impressions we get from his letters, how they may cohere, or maybe they don't cohere and they just stand alongside each other. There is one more thing I need to mention in this mix. When we look at Paul, the Jewish apostle, he is also actually in a subordinate role when perceived from the context of the elite dominating power perception of the Roman Empire. As a member of the Jewish people, he is a member of a subjugated people. He has been beaten on the back. He is suffering. He is vulnerable. And all of this does not cohere to the image of masculinity that was dominating in the ideological discourse of Greek or Roman perception. So from that perspective, he is not a true man. So we have two images. He is on the one side claiming authority over his congregations and has a hierarchical perception of gender relations, but from a different perspective. He is a member of a subjugated people, and in that sense, he cannot claim true manliness or true masculinity. So let's see what we can do with all of this. It has to be stated that questions concerning gender are not at the forefront of Paul's letters. There are some texts that address concerns including women and the relationship between women and men, but they are not focused specifically on. Sometimes Paul talks about women, sometimes he greets women, sometimes he recommends women, like Phoebe. So the statements of Paul are sort of a colorful mix, I would say. And then he has certain perceptions of women. Women should be subordinate to men. So let's start with Corinthians. What do we find in Corinthians? The key chapters where he talks about women are, and the most controversial ones actually, are chapters 11, the beginning, up to verse 11, and following chapter 14, and they are the highly controversial verses 33 to 36. So this is what I'm going to focus on. The ambivalence of Paul's statements concerning women have frequently been noted most explicitly, as I said, in 1 Corinthians. There are publications like the one by Antoinette Clark Weir, who thinks Paul, in the whole of 1 Corinthians, addresses problems he has with women prophets. I'm not so sure that this is what drives Paul writing this letter. Nevertheless, it is clear there are some issues going on there. The fact that Paul addresses issues concerning women in this letter indicates in itself that Paul takes it as self-evident that women play an active role when the Christ followers come together as an ecclesia. This is why the issue in chapter 11 and in chapter 14 arises in the first place. So he takes it as presupposed, doesn't criticize, doesn't question that women also participate actively when they come together in the ecclesia. So the mere fact that Paul considers it necessary to provide guidance to men and women concerning the orderly way when they come together demonstrates that these gatherings were mixed. Men and women were together in the one and the same room, and they both were playing active roles. In the context of Greek and Roman society, in which gender segregation was the norm rather than the exception, at least at the theoretical level, this is in itself noteworthy, and the active role of women in such mixed assemblies even more so. So Paul never challenges the participation of women in these gatherings in any way. What he does address is the conduct of both men and women on these occasions. Concerning this, as well as concerning the course of action when married to an unbeliever, the Corinthians have asked for Paul's guidance. They wrote to him perites, as 1 Corinthians 7:1 demonstrates. The Corinthians were concerned and unsure. They were unsure how to behave in these situations. This indicates that they probably were not familiar how to conduct an assembly where men and women were together and acted together. Maybe they had some knowledge from synagogue gatherings they had attended, but as Gentile Christ followers, they did not actively participate in synagogue gatherings, but now in the Ecclesia to Theou, they did actively participate in these gatherings. The communication between Paul and the Corinthians is thus, that's a side thought, an example of a cultural translation process. What does it mean to come together as men and women when you turn to the true and living God? So Paul gives guidance of something he knows from his Jewish tradition into the world of Greeks, Galatians, and Romans. He does this in light of Jewish tradition and practice, because there, mixed gatherings of people who worship the God of Israel would be considered normal, common practice in the synagogues throughout the empire. The fact that women were part of these synagogue gatherings is mentioned frequently, and there is no reason to doubt the respective literary sources. The presence of women and children as part of all Israel, when the law is being read, Torah, is attested in biblical text. We find that in, I just mentioned a few. Can you hear me all right?
We lost the sound for a moment.
Oh, okay, I'll stop.
Now it's coming.
Is it all right again?
Yes. Go ahead,
Okay.
please.
All right? Okay. Maybe I go back a few steps.
2 steps or use 1.
Okay. The
Please.
sound is okay now. Okay.
Yeah, the
okay.
sound is fine.
Okay, the sound is back. What I said was, Paul draws on his Jewish tradition, where in synagogue gatherings, men and women were assembling together. And the presence of women and children when all Israel is mentioned is presupposed, for instance, already in biblical text, when the law, the Torah, is being read. In Deuteronomy 29, 10 to 11, 13, 11 to 12, etc., etc. I won't mention these all. And this is communal practice also in the synagogue of the first century. So we hear from Josephus in his report about the decree of Halicarnassus. He explicitly mentions men and women together as those who are granted the right to build a synagogue, assemble, and celebrate Sabbath. And the same in the decree of the Sardians. Also, Philo mentions women as be part of the synagogue gathering as a matter of fact. So the whole of the Jewish people is described by Philo as philosophers, meaning he presents women as philosophers. The implications of this clear evidence of synagogue assemblies as mixed groups of men and women in the first century are significant. Given that the activities during these assemblies included the reading of the scriptures and teaching as well as prayer, this means that women were taught and participated in prayer alongside men. Neither Philo nor Josephus refers to an exclusion of women when it comes to learning the scriptures. Paul's Pharisaic identity may shed further light on the inclusion of women, not just as members of the movement, but as participants in the actual assemblies of the ecclesia. The Jewish scholar Tal Ilan has presented convincing arguments, in my view, that women were part of the Pharisaic movement as members in their own right. And she prevents an interpretation of a text from the Tosefta, which is a clear reference to Pharisees. So there a verse states, I quote the Tosefta Demai 2:16, a daughter of an Am Haaretz married to a chaver is a Pharisee, a woman Am Haaretz married to a chaver should undergo initiation in order to be trustworthy. This, Talilan says, demonstrates that women were initiated into the movement of the Pharisees in their own right. Based on this interpretation, Talilan argues, women were members, Pharisees, and participated also in the meals of the Chaverim, of the communal meals of the Pharisees. If we follow her evidence, this provides further evidence that Paul would have been familiar with and would have taken it for granted that women were active members and participants in their own right in a subgroup of Judaism, so it would not come as a surprise that Paul would have considered the participation of women in the assemblies of the Christ movement as something normal. So I talked already about the evidence of active participation of women that we can gain through Philo's writings and through Josephus. I will not reiterate this. There are numerous passages which indicate this very clearly. So, the clear evidence of mixed assemblies in synagogue communities, the participation of women in prayer and singing, and the high value attributed to prophets as well as prophetesses all indicate that the practice and guidance of Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16 reflect this Jewish tradition. He presupposes the joint participation of men and women. He presupposes that they both pray and prophesy. The only concern is that this is being done in an orderly way. This observation does, of course, not exclude that Paul had a hierarchical gender understanding. Such a perception he shared in variations with, I would think, almost everybody around the Mediterranean. There was no feminism in antiquity. So the perception that women were subordinate to men was not a particularity of Jewish tradition that Paul simply introduced into the Christ movement, as has sometimes been claimed in earlier feminist approaches. It is also not self-evident that the issues discussed in this passage around head coverings inherently bear the mark of hierarchy, although Paul seems to present them in that way. But let's look at, in more detail, at what Paul argues concerning this veil or this head covering. The Corinthians meet together and they pray and prophesy, both men and women. And Paul advises that when women pray and prophesy, they should have their hair covered, whilst when men pray and prophesy, they should not have their hair covered. So, what is going on? Let's look at the verses in detail. In 11:2, Paul says, okay, but I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ. So, clearly, there is a hierarchy here. Not astonishing, as I noted already. He does not challenge this hierarchical perception. But interestingly, the gender hierarchy is part of another hierarchy, namely that of Christ and God. The word used here for head, kephale, is most likely meant here in the sense of patriarch or leader. Some alternative translations have been proposed, such as source or origins, in attempts to understand Paul's argumentation here in a less hierarchical way. According to such interpretations or translations, man then is the source or origin of women. But in my view, this does not render this image more egalitarian. It doesn't matter whether you're the source or origin of something. You're still before the one you're the source of. So I do not see any egalitarian move here on Paul's part. This is hierarchy full stop. But I think it is important that this gender hierarchy is actually embedded in the bigger hierarchy in relation to Christ and to God. So I think this shapes and characterizes the gender hierarchy. It's not absolute. They are under Christ, under God. Now let's look at the next verse, some next verses, 4 and 5. That's this famous head covering verses. Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head disgraces his head. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. It is one and the same thing as having her head shaved. Evidently, both pray and prophesy when they come together. The head covering of both is under discussion here. That's often omitted, but the head covering of both is under discussion here. And it is said in relation to honor and shame for both, not only the head covering of women. The issue of honor and shame has been widely debated, noting that cultures differ to some extent in that sense from Western European and North American culture. I cannot go into detail about this here, but I think there needs to be more research into this honor-shame aspect than has been done so far. I've recently read a fascinating book by Caroline Barton, Fire in the Bones. It's an older book, but she talks about the Roman understanding of honor and shame, and I have not digested that quite yet, but I think it's important. The question of dress code and other aspects of outer appearance are, by the way, not a thing of the past, nor of just other cultures than Western European cultures, by the way. They are hotly debated also among us. But let's go back to Paul. We need to note that he only refers to head coverings during assembly times. So when they come together, not as a general rule, not as a general dress code, okay? Haircut only comes into play as an example in comparison to head covering when they come together. Now, a number of interpretations have been proposed for Paul's guidance in recent approaches, and I just list a few of these. Paul may insist on maintaining clear expressions of difference between men and women in specific context. 2, he may wish to protect Christ followers against suspicions from outsiders that they may be involved in immoral practices when they come together as mixed gatherings, since women without head coverings could be seen as behaving in an inappropriate manner. 3, this is a variant of the perception of 2. It has been argued, or could be argued, that the issue concerns specific hairstyles. Women then should only pray and prophesy when their hair is decently styled, as can be seen in statues of Roman women with their adornment of hair. You know these probably better than I do. Loose hair was associated with loose women, and women at marriage age or married should have their hair plaited, stacked, as a sign that they were not sexually available. Such elaborate hairstyle were the sign of a powerful Roman elite wife, the matrona. And over against this, loose hair indicated sexual availability, sign of prostitutes, and was also the sign of subjugated nations in metaphorical depictions. For instance, we can see that in the statues in Aphrodisias, where Britannia or Armenia are the personification of the subjugated nations, and their hair is loose. And the fourth proposal has suggested that Paul explicitly refers to having something on your head means that women need special protection. So all of these suggestions have some value, but they cannot be conclusively ascertained. And the most puzzling aspect in Paul's argument is that he mentions angels in this passage. He says this is the reason why women should have exousia over their head. In my view, so this is my view now, it is highly likely that Paul has the sexual connotation of women's hair in mind here. This seems obvious in his drastic image of shaving the woman's hair entirely if she does not have a hair covering, which he equals with not wearing a head cover or veil. Shaving a woman's hair expresses shame and humiliation, and was one of the options of shaming and punishing a woman, not just in antiquity, and we do not need to look back 2,000 years to understand what Paul means. The image of dishonor by not covering the hair when praying could also be related to the fact that the majority of Christ-following women and men belonged to a class that was not part of the elite. The women were most likely not elite Roman matrons. They were slaves or freed women, which means that they had to be sexually available to their masters, certainly in their previous lives. Ovid refers to them as those who lacked ribbons in their hair and who were not allowed to wear long dresses. They are not respectable women due to their status as slaves and freed women. From this, it follows that these women of the lower class or slaves might not have considered it their duty or might have thought they were not allowed to cover their heads, as would have been natural for a Roman elite woman, a matrona. So that if Paul advises them or requests them to wear a head covering, elevates them to the status of a respectable woman. Men, on the other hand, should exactly not cover their head when they are praying. This does make sense when we remember that elite men, and above all the Caesars, preferably got themselves depicted as Pontifex Maximus, performing a sacrifice, notably always with their head covered by the toga pulled over their head. This represented the highly valued virtue of pietas, piety. For a man, for an elite Roman man to have his hair covered while performing a religious duty was an expression of pietas and an expression and demonstration of his power and authority. He performed the highest act of providing sacrifice for the deities. It demonstrated the covering of the head of the man demonstrated the direct link of these powerful men with the divine word and indicated that their piety secured peace and stability for the Roman Empire. The toga pulled over their heads represented that. The Caesars presented themselves as the father of the fatherland, pater patria, the almighty pater familias of the Roman Imperium. Although there were most likely not many elite men among the members of the ecclesia who would have had the right to wear the toga, the practice and image would have certainly been known and present in Roman Corinth. And it is clear Paul does not want male Christ followers to present themselves in this vein when they related to the God of Israel through Christ. Paul refers to Christ followers as brothers and sisters. They should not be patrons over each other. And this advice in that sense resonates with the Matthean call, and call no one father on earth, for you have one Father only, the one in heaven. As far as men are concerned, the request to pray and prophesy without their heads covered would mean a conscious distinction from Roman pious practice. While this would make sense in my view, this does not conclusively explain the request for the head covering of women. I think the aspect of rendering them respectable is one which is quite convincing for me, but the issue of the angels we have yet to address. What follows before Paul arrives at this aspect of the angels is a further confirmation that Paul has a hierarchical gender perception. In 11:7 to 9, he says again, for a man ought not to have his head veiled, since he is the image and reflection or glory of God, but woman is the reflection or glory of man. Indeed, man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man, etc., etc. So here we have the hierarchy again. And now he refers to the Genesis narrative, the creation narrative, although to the second creation narrative. Anyway, we have already stated, yes, Paul has a hierarchical perception of gender. Now we come to this business with the angels, which is the most puzzling. And again, there are a number of interpretations have been proposed. The veil, the exousia she needs to have over her head could mean she has to express self-control. She has to be in control of herself. The exousia could mean the domination, the male domination over women. That is actually the stance of the church fathers. So the head covering then would be a sign of the submission of wives under the power of their husbands. But nobody really comes up with a decisive explanation why this should be done because of the angels. Let's consider this for a moment. We know that the angels are frequently mentioned in the text of Qumran. Qumran is almost obsessed with angels. Now there is one perception, perception in Qumran and in other Jewish texts, that when people assemble to praise God and worship him, sing to him, they are actually tuning into the heavenly worship of the angels at God's throne. So if, and this is an if Paul thinks that the Corinthian assemblies and all assemblies of Christ followers, when they pray to God and prophesy, that they tune also in to the heavenly worship of the angels, then he would assume that angels were present when they assemble. The head covering of the women would then be a kind of apotropaic means to protect women from angels, the danger of angels, as is already expressed in Genesis 6:2. You know, the angels took a liking to the daughters of men and desired them in their beauty. Hair, with its erotic connotation, I mentioned that, would then be a risk when seen by angels. They could get attracted again and could seduce the angels again. This interpretation has the advantage that it refers to all women, married or not married, and keeps in mind the specific context of praying and prophesying. I noted already, Paul does not make a general statement about how women should dress in everyday life. The head covering is specifically mentioned when they pray and prophesy. So to me, that would make a bit of sense. I don't know the final answer to the question, why are the angels invoked here? Now, so I think maybe this is part of the reason for the head covering. And as I mentioned, I think the head covering may actually elevate women of low status to a perception of women of respectable status by having their head covers. So despite the hierarchical worldview of Paul, the hierarchical gender perception of Paul, he emphasizes the equality, in one sense, of men and women prophesying and praying together. And at the end of the passage, actually, he also mentions that they are mutually dependent on each other. So within this hierarchical theoretical stance, we have traces of equality and mutuality in gender relation. So let me move now to the other controversial passage. I'm still in time, yes. 1 Corinthians 14, 33 to 35. Does all of this, what I said just now, trajectories of equality and mutuality in Paul's argument in chapter 11, how does this cohere with the other key passage concerning women in 1 Corinthians 14? Clearly, there seems to be a tension as far as the active participation of women is concerned. If this is not an interpolation, as some have argued, I think again, we may find some explanation for this passage in Paul's Jewish tradition. I don't think this passage is an interpolation, by the way. I think it is Pauline, and I can show you why I think this. If we trust Josephus and Philo now again, then a distinction seems to have been made between women participating in synagogue assemblies, between being active in prayer, singing, and possibly prophesying, and in the reading and active reading and interpretation of the scriptures. While information concerning the reading of the scriptures is unclear and possibly may be performed by any member of the assembly, Paul insists that interpretation and teaching during synagogue meetings is performed by a man of special knowledge, a leader, teacher, or as he calls him, ruler of the community. During such exposition by a man of special knowledge, the assembly members listen in silence, Philo says, in silence. It is evident that not everybody is considered to be qualified to read and teach or explain the scriptures, but only those, and now I quote Philo, who are very learned, explain to them what is of great importance and use, lessons by which the whole of their lives may be improved. Silence is also the rule among the therapeutae, Philo writes, when the scriptures are read and explained. And the assembly has to be conducted in a clear and orderly manner. Now, similarly, 1 Corinthians 14 actually deals with the order during assembly meetings. Paul seems to be concerned that these meetings are conducted appropriately. The mutual upbuilding in the ecclesia during assembly meeting is at the center of his concern, but in order for this to be possible, the members, for instance, have to take turns when speaking. So he says in 14:30 to 31, they shouldn't speak all at once. In some instances, Paul advises that silence is better than speaking. For instance, when there is nobody present who can interpret what is said in a tongue, or when a revelation is made to someone sitting nearby, the first one should be silent. So silence is a topic here in chapter 14. The issue of women talking and being silent is raised in this context. That is, not in a general way. I think given the context, women are not exclusively and generally told to be silent during the assembly meetings, but in relation to a particular aspect, similar to other aspects Paul mentions in chapter 14, where people should behave orderly or be silent at a specific moment. It seems that Paul does not refer to just any kind of talking, but one that is specifically geared towards learning in relation to scriptures, as indicated by the word mathein in verse 34. If they want to mathein, learn something, they should be silent. Although I'm not sure that the reading and interpretation of the scriptures was part of ecclesia meetings as yet. Teaching may refer to some oral traditions, Christ-centered or other, and it could be that in tune with Jewish understanding, teaching was the domain of leading men, and anything related to this teaching should not be raised by women during the assembly meeting. If listening in silence generally was part of the practice of teaching, then the two aspects could have been combined here by Paul. Again, based on this evidence, it should not be seen as a reintroduction of some restrictive practice in a previously more liberating ecclesia, but this is most likely part of the existing Jewish ethos of mixed assemblies. Both men and women participate. They do this, but it should be done in an orderly manner, in analogy to synagogue assemblies. The mixed character of the ecclesia, as well as joint participation in these gatherings, including guidance about proper order, are based on Jewish traditions and practice in which Paul was well embedded. Although some aspects of these assemblies and the guidance for proper conduct may have also analogies in other traditions, the traditions with which Christ followers from the nations were familiar, I think Paul's guidance here is very much rooted in Jewish traditions. I think this could be expected. And in that sense, Paul is not silencing the women in church. Paul is giving guidance about orderly behavior at a particular point of an assembly meeting, which has to do with learning and teaching, which was the prerogative of men at the time. So Paul's Judaism, and more specifically his Pharisaism, may have been decisive for his advice concerning the Christ followers' behavior during assembly meetings. I skip now, for the sake of time, a little bit of advice he gives to married women. Those who have the translation will now see it comes to advice to married women and how they should behave. They could be married or not. They should stay with an unbeliever. Also, this guidance of Paul most likely comes from his Pharisaic background. So, we do not need Paul to be a more liberal Jew when it comes to his guidance concerning women over against more traditional Jewish stances. This is an argument that has been brought forward also sometimes by feminist interpretations. Paul's advice and guidance concerning issues concerning women, or how men and women should relate in these ecclesiae of God, is consistent with general practice and guidance in Jewish tradition of the period. So it is neither narrow nor liberating. It is Jewish tradition. And Paul tries to replicate this, or tries to introduce this tradition, now adapted for people from the nations, in the Christ movement. So Paul is concerned that these people, these Christ followers from the nations, learn how to be in Christ and to be seen as respectable people also by the outside world. The guidance he gives, where else should it be rooted than in Jewish tradition? Only Jews did what they did in relation to the one God, to their God. And these Christ followers from the nations, these Christ assemblies, in this Christ assembly in Corinth, also has to learn how to practice, how to conduct in an orderly manner their lives in relation to the one God of Israel. Even the leadership role of women that we can discern from the Pauline letters reveals similarities with the Jewish imprint of Paul's practice, rather than some innovation that he introduced into this movement. Years ago, in the 80s, Bernadette Bruton published a small book about women leaders in the ancient synagogues, and she analyzed numerous inscriptions and found that female leadership was possible in Jewish tradition, as it was, by the way, also in Greek and Roman tradition of the period. I cannot go into detail about this at the moment, but the fact that Bernadette Bruton could demonstrate that women were leaders in ancient synagogues, this renders my interpretation of the role of women in 1 Corinthians 11 and 14 as highly probable in a Jewish context. So Paul's explicit reference to women is neither reactionary, because he has a hierarchical gender perspective, nor particularly liberating. It is firmly rooted in Jewish traditions. They are practical guidance and understanding from within Jewish tradition and practice, now applied to non-Jews who joined with Israel to worship God as their God also. So far, what I have to say on Paul's gender perception in 1 Corinthians. Thank you for your attention.